He never expected his father's birthday party to turn into a life-changing decision. The room glittered with diamonds, designer gowns, and champagne, every socialite competing for his father's approval. The millionaire CEO stood proud, announcing, in front of everyone, "Tonight, my son will choose the woman who will become his mother." Gasps filled the room as eyes turned to him. The heir, the golden boy. They expected him to pick elegance, status, power. But then, his gaze drifted, past the crowd, toward the quiet maid standing in the shadows, holding an empty tray, unaware of the storm about to hit her life. What happens when the son rejects wealth for humility, and the world explodes with scandal? The evening began long before the first guests arrived. Inside the grand mansion of the Livingston family, every corner shimmered under crystal chandeliers that had seen generations of wealth. The marble floors gleamed like mirrors, polished to perfection by a staff that moved like shadows, ensuring not a single detail was out of place. Outside, luxury cars lined the driveway, and the red carpet stretched toward the towering golden doors, a pathway to a world where opulence reigned supreme. It wasn't just another birthday celebration. This was a spectacle, the kind of event that made headlines in elite circles. For months, whispers had spread that tonight would mark a monumental announcement from William Livingston, the man who built his empire from the ground up, a self-made billionaire who now wore power like a second skin. In his 60s, William remained commanding, with eyes that measured a person's worth in an instant and a voice that could silence a room. To him, reputation was everything. His wealth wasn't merely a privilege, it was a fortress, and everyone who entered his world played by his rules. At the center of this carefully orchestrated evening was his only son, Adrian. Tall, composed, and strikingly handsome, Adrian had grown up under the relentless gaze of society and the weight of his father's expectations. From his earliest years, every step, every choice had been scrutinized, molded to fit the image of a perfect heir. He had attended the best schools, mingled with royalty, and learned to speak the language of influence. Yet, beneath the polished exterior lay a man at odds with the life handed to him. To outsiders, he seemed like a prince destined for a throne. But inside, he longed for something simpler, something real. The mansion buzzed with anticipation as the guests began to arrive. Socialites in shimmering gowns floated across the ballroom, their laughter crisp like the clink of champagne glasses. Men in tailored suits exuded power, each handshake a silent negotiation of status. Women eyed each other with calculated glances, diamonds glittering like promises that wealth could buy happiness. Among them were the city's most influential figures, heiresses groomed for perfection, widows draped in elegance, and ambitious women who saw tonight as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. For them, this wasn't just a celebration. It was a hunt for the ultimate prize, the heart of a billionaire's son. But hidden among the glitter and grandeur was a figure no one noticed. Isabella moved quietly, balancing a tray of crystal flutes with steady hands. She wore the standard black and white uniform of the staff, her hair tied back neatly, her posture humble. To the guests, she was invisible, a background presence meant to serve and disappear. Yet if anyone had cared to look closely, they would have seen the quiet strength in her eyes, the dignity with which she carried herself despite the weight of her circumstances. Isabella had been working in the mansion for 3 years, ever since life had dealt her a cruel blow that left her with nothing but determination to survive. Unlike the women who floated across the room in couture gowns, Isabella owned nothing of luxury. Her world was defined by long hours, modest meals, and a small rented room miles away from this palace of excess. But even in hardship, she had preserved a grace that couldn't be bought, a rare quality that made her stand out, though no one of importance seemed to notice. No one, except Adrian. He had first seen her months ago carrying linens through one of the hallways. There had been nothing extraordinary about the moment, yet something about her presence lingered in his mind. Perhaps it was the way she moved, quiet, purposeful, without the pretense he had grown so accustomed to. Or perhaps it was her eyes, which held a depth that made him feel seen in a way no one else ever had. In a world where everyone wanted something from him, Isabella asked for nothing. And that, more than anything, drew him to her. As the evening unfolded, Adrian stood near the grand staircase, his expression calm, but his thoughts restless. He knew what this night meant to his father. For weeks, William had spoken of legacy, of stability, of the importance of choosing wisely. He had made it clear that Adrian's personal life was no longer just his own. It was a reflection of the empire, an extension of the Livingston name. Adrian had nodded, as he always did, though inside he felt the invisible chains tighten. William moved through the crowd like a monarch surveying his court, offering smiles that never reached his eyes. He thrived on admiration, on the whispered envy that followed him wherever he went. To him, power wasn't simply about money, it was about control, and tonight, he intended to demonstrate that control in the most dramatic way possible. At precisely 8 o'clock, the music softened, and all eyes turned to the stage at the far end of the ballroom. A spotlight bathed William in a golden glow as he raised his glass. The room fell silent, expectant. His words began with charm and gratitude, a masterful performance that drew laughter and applause. But then, his tone shifted, carrying a weight that silenced even the whispers. Tonight, he announced, was not just a birthday celebration. It was a night of destiny. In a move that left the crowd breathless, William declared that his son, Adrian, would choose a woman from among the finest families present, someone worthy of becoming the matriarch of the Livingston Empire. A collective gasp rippled through the room as eyes darted toward Adrian, and then toward the elegant women who now stood straighter, their smiles sharpening like blades. It was a spectacle perfectly designed for drama, and William knew it. He relished the shock, the anticipation, the subtle chaos brewing beneath the surface. For him, this was more than a choice. It was a statement, a display of power and prestige, and in his mind the outcome was inevitable. Adrian would choose someone who reflected their world, someone who would strengthen the fortress he had built. Anything less would be unthinkable. But as the guests applauded, Adrian felt the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on him, demanding conformity. He scanned the crowd, past the painted smiles and glittering jewels, past the women who saw him, not as a man but as a crown, and then his gaze found her. Isabella, standing near the corner with her tray, unaware that her life was about to change forever. She didn't know that at that very moment Adrian's decision had already been made, not out of defiance but out of a longing that had grown quietly, relentlessly. In a world obsessed with appearances, he craved authenticity. In a sea of ambition, he sought humility. And in the game his father was playing, Adrian was about to make a move that no one saw coming. The night was only beginning, but the fault line had already formed. Soon, the tremor would become an earthquake that would shake the very foundation of everything William Livingston had built. The glittering ballroom, the lavish celebration, the flawless image, it would all crack under the weight of one choice. A choice that would ignite scandal, unleash fury, and test the strength of love against the might of power. And somewhere in the shadows, oblivious to the storm gathering around her, Isabella adjusted the tray in her hands and prepared to serve. The storm gathering around her, Isabella adjusted the tray in her hands and prepared to serve the next glass of champagne, unaware that her life, too, was about to change forever. The announcement lingered in the air like a storm cloud, thick with tension and unspoken questions. Applause faded into murmurs, and the atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted. Women who had once stood gracefully now leaned forward, their expressions sharpened with sudden purpose. Conversations sparked like electrical currents, hushed and hurried, each sentence dripping with speculation and ambition. This was no longer just a party. It was a contest. Adrian felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, every pair of eyes turning his way, each glance demanding compliance with the script his father had written. He had grown accustomed to being watched, to performing a role that satisfied expectations. But tonight, something inside him rebelled. The thought of selecting a woman as if she were a prize at an auction filled him with quiet rage. His life, his heart. His father believed they were bargaining chips for prestige and influence. He forced a polite smile as guests approached, offering their congratulations, their well-practiced compliments, their veiled suggestions. Each word felt hollow, rehearsed. The women surrounding him radiated beauty, their gowns shimmering under the chandelier's glow, their perfume weaving an intoxicating spell. They laughed at the right moments, spoke with poised confidence, and dropped hints of lineage and luxury, as if each syllable could tip the scales in their favor. They were perfect, too perfect. Every gesture, every smile, felt like a performance designed to secure the title his father dangled like a golden crown. As Adrian endured the onslaught of charm, his gaze drifted again toward the edges of the room. His chest tightened with something unspoken, an ache for freedom, for truth, for someone who saw the man behind the fortune. And he knew, with startling clarity, that his father's grand design would shatter tonight. Across the room, William watched his son like a hawk, his smile stretched wide for the cameras and curious onlookers, but his eyes cold, calculating. He thrived on control, on bending people to his will, and tonight was no exception. To him, this wasn't just about Adrian choosing a wife. It was about consolidating alliances, strengthening his empire through the oldest currency in the world, marriage. Every influential family represented tonight carried value, and William intended to claim it. But as he observed Adrian's distant gaze, a flicker of unease brushed his thoughts. His son wasn't mingling with enthusiasm. He wasn't drawn to the circle of women as expected. Instead, there was a subtle resistance in his stance, a quiet defiance simmering beneath his composure. William dismissed the notion at first. Adrian was obedient, groomed for this life. Still, a whisper of doubt persisted, faint but relentless. The music swelled, laughter resumed, and the competition intensified. Women positioned themselves strategically, like pieces on a chessboard, each maneuver calculated to capture Adrian's attention. They complimented his suit, praised his father, and hinted at shared dreams they never truly held. Their smiles gleamed, but behind the gloss lay hunger. Hunger for status, for security, for power. Adrian played his part, listening politely, offering courteous nods, yet his mind drifted elsewhere. Every word from their lips sounded like a script rehearsed for an audience that never existed in his world. He felt suffocated beneath layers of artifice, longing for a breath of honesty. And then, in a fleeting glance, he saw her again, Isabella, pausing near the doorway with an empty tray, her expression serene despite the chaos swirling around her. That single moment pierced through the noise like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He remembered the first time he truly noticed her, not as a maid, but as a person. It had been during one of his father's late-night gatherings, a night heavy with politics and deals disguised as conversations. While others laughed and schemed, Isabella had been quietly arranging flowers in the corner, her focus unbroken, her presence calm amid the clamor. There was no pretense in her, no hunger for power, just an authenticity that felt like a rare jewel in a world drowning in imitation. Now, standing amid the glittering crowd, Adrian felt a resolve harden within him. He was done living as a pawn in his father's empire. Tonight, he would make a choice, not for wealth, not for legacy, but for himself. Unaware of the storm brewing inside Adrian, Isabella continued her work, oblivious to the role she was about. to play in a scandal that would shake the city. For her, tonight was just another shift, another night of balancing trays and fading into the background. She had learned long ago that invisibility was safety, that drawing attention in places like this invited danger, and so she kept her eyes low, her steps measured, her presence almost ghost-like. But fate has a way of dragging the unseen into the spotlight. As the evening progressed, William called for attention once more, his voice slicing through the music, like a blade. He invited his son to the stage, gesturing with an authority that brooked no refusal. Cameras flashed, guests hushed, and all eyes converged on Adrian as he ascended the steps. The room pulsed with expectation, the air thick with anticipation. This was the moment, the climax of William's carefully crafted spectacle. Adrian stood, beneath the chandelier, its crystals scattering light across his composed face. Outwardly, he was calm, every inch the air his father had raised. Inwardly, a storm raged. He scanned the sea of faces below, women poised like goddesses, their smiles bright with concealed desperation. He could almost hear their thoughts, feel the weight of their ambitions pressing against him. But then, his eyes drifted past them, past the diamonds and silk, to the corner where Isabella lingered with hesitant steps, as if debating whether to retreat to the kitchen or remain unseen. In that instant, the world fell away. The music, the murmurs, the suffocating weight of expectation, all dissolved into a single point of clarity. He knew what he would do. When his father handed him the microphone, Adrian spoke with a steady voice, his words measured but resolute. Gasps rippled through the room as he declared that his choice was not among the glittering elite, not among those who had spent the evening vying for his attention. His choice, he said, was someone who embodied grace, humility, and strength, not in wealth, but in character. And then, with the eyes of an empire upon him, Adrian turned, his gaze locking on Isabella. Stunned silence gripped the room. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then whispers erupted like sparks leaping from dry tinder, growing louder, harsher, tinged with disbelief and scorn. Cameras swung toward the corner where Isabella stood frozen, the tray slipping from her grasp and crashing to the floor in a shatter of glass and silver. Her heart thundered in her chest, her breath catching like a bird trapped in a cage. This couldn't be real. This had to be some cruel joke. But Adrian's eyes held no mockery, only unwavering truth. And in that moment, as the room descended into chaos, the fault line became an earthquake. William's smile cracked, his composure splintering under the weight of a reality he could neither control nor contain. The empire he had built on dominance and appearances trembled on its gilded foundation, threatened by the quiet strength of a woman he had deemed invisible. The storm had broken, and nothing would ever be the same again. The ballroom erupted into chaos. The sound of shattering glass still echoed when the first wave of whispers surged through the crowd like a rippling storm. Isabella stood motionless, her breath caught in her throat, her hands trembling as shards of crystal glittered at her feet. For a moment, she felt as if she were watching everything from outside her body, unable to process the reality pressing down on her. Every face in the room had turned toward her, some wide with disbelief, others twisted with disdain, many burning with envy and contempt. She wanted to disappear, to run. But her feet refused to move. Across the room, cameras flashed in a frenzy, immortalizing the scandal that would dominate headlines for weeks. Guests clutched their pearls, literally and figuratively, as though witnessing a crime against the sacred order of wealth and status. Murmurs sharpened into voices, voices hardened into accusations, and soon the air vibrated with outrage. How dare he? Is this some kind of joke? A maid? In this house? The venom in their tones lashed like whips, slicing through the fragile silence that Isabella clung to like a lifeline. She lowered her eyes, her cheeks burning, her mind racing through 1,000 impossible thoughts. Why me? Why now? What will they do to me? Adrian stood still, his posture unyielding, his expression unreadable. But inside his heart pounded with relentless certainty. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. For years he had lived in the shadows of expectations, bound by chains of privilege that glittered like gold but cut like steel. Tonight, he had broken free. And yet, as he scanned the furious faces before him, he understood the cost of that freedom would be steep. Then came the voice that froze the room, the voice that carried the weight of empires and the fury of betrayal. William Livingston. He stepped forward slowly, each stride radiating controlled power, though his clenched jaw betrayed the storm boiling beneath his calm facade. The crowd parted for him like water, their whispers dying into an expectant hush. Cameras swung to capture his every move, sensing blood in the water. William stopped at the edge of the stage, his gaze locked on his son. For a long, searing moment, father and son stood in silent confrontation, the weight of generations pressing between them. Adrian met his father's eyes without flinching. Gone was the obedient heir, the polished prince who bowed to power. In his place stood a man who had chosen his own truth, a truth that defied everything William held sacred. The silence cracked when William's voice, low and cutting, sliced through the air. It was not the voice of a father, it was the voice of a ruler whose authority had been challenged before his kingdom. Though he spoke without raising his tone, the venom in his words dripped like acid, scorching the fragile veneer of civility left in the room. What followed was not a conversation, but a battle, a war waged without weapons, yet no less brutal. William unleashed his fury in precise, calculated blows, striking where he knew it would hurt most. He spoke of legacy, of bloodlines, of responsibility and shame. He painted Isabella as an interloper, a stain on the empire, a threat to the fortress. He had built brick by golden brick. His words dripped with scorn, each syllable designed to crush her spirit into dust. The crowd watched, spellbound, feeding on the spectacle like vultures circling a wounded creature. Some whispered in pity, others smirked in schadenfreude, all united in the unspoken belief that this was the end, that William would crush this rebellion, as he had crushed every obstacle in his life. But then Adrian spoke, and his words were not a plea nor an apology. They were a declaration, a defiance that rang out like a bell of war, shattering the last illusions of control. He said he would not sacrifice his soul for the hollow crown his father offered. He said love was not a transaction, and happiness could not be bartered in boardrooms. He said Isabella was worth more than every jewel in the room. He advanced a step, his presence towering like a storm about to break, his fury barely leashed. For an instant, it seemed he might strike his son, that centuries of civility would dissolve under the weight of raw, unbridled rage. But then, with the precision of a man who had built an empire on strategy, William turned, not to Adrian, but to Isabella. The crowd held its breath as his eyes locked on her, cold and sharp as a blade. He spoke her name like a curse, lacing it with venom that made her blood run cold. He accused her of scheming, of seducing his son for wealth and power. He promised to ruin her, to crush her, until not a trace of her existence remained. Each word fell like a hammer blow, and Isabella felt her knees weaken, her lungs constrict, the ground tilt beneath her feet. But before she could speak, before she could even breathe, Adrian moved. He descended the stage in 3 strides, his presence cutting through the sea of onlookers like a blade of light. He reached Isabella and placed himself between her and his father, his stance fierce, his voice like steel. He said if William touched her, in word or deed, he would walk away from the Livingston Empire forever. The room exploded. Gasps erupted into shouts, cameras into blinding storms of light. The whispers became a roar, a tidal wave of shock and disbelief crashing against the gilded walls of the mansion. William's composure shattered. For the first time in his life, the man who commanded nations and bent markets to his will stood, powerless before his own blood. His fury burned hotter than ever, but beneath it flickered something he could not kill. Fear. Fear of losing the son who was his legacy, his pride, his creation. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted. Adrian turned to Isabella, his gaze steady, his voice low but unyielding. He told her she had nothing to fear, that no amount of wealth, no fortress of gold, no army of men could separate them now. His words were a lifeline, pulling her from the abyss of terror into the fragile light of hope. The crowd, once united in judgment, now fractured. Some recoiled in horror, clinging to the old order like a drowning man to driftwood. Others whispered with awe, sensing history bending before their eyes. And in the farthest corner where shadows clung like secrets, the cameras rolled on, immortalizing a rebellion that would ignite headlines and scandal for years to come. The war was not over, but the first battle had been won. William turned away. At last, his silence heavier than thunder, his retreat a storm gathering strength for the reckoning to come. The night was far from finished. But as Adrian took Isabella's trembling hand and led her from the stage, one truth burned brighter than the chandeliers above. The empire had cracked, and through the fracture bloomed something no power on earth could stop. Love. The night had ended, but its echoes reverberated through every corner of the city like distant thunder. By dawn, the headlines blazed across every media outlet. Livingston heir shocks high society, chooses maid over millionaire elite. The photographs were relentless. Adrian shielding Isabella from the cameras, William's face frozen in fury, the glittering chaos of the ballroom immortalized for the world to devour. The internet erupted. Social media became a battlefield of opinions. Some called it romantic defiance, others branded it scandalous betrayal. Memes flooded timelines. Talk shows dissected every frame of the footage. Overnight, Isabella's name, a name that had lived in obscurity, became a storm whispered in every household, from penthouses to modest apartments. But fame was a double-edged sword. For Isabella, the sudden blaze of attention felt suffocating. She woke that morning to a torrent of messages, some dripping with admiration, others spitting venom. Strangers praised her courage, while others accused her of being a gold digger, a manipulator, a nobody clawing her way into power. Each word pierced like shards of glass, shredding the fragile peace she had clung to. In the privacy of her small rented room, she stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror, searching for the woman everyone spoke of, the schemer, the temptress, the Cinderella plucked from rags to riches. But all she saw was herself. A woman who had scrubbed floors, folded linens, carried trays. A woman who never asked for this war. Yet, beneath the fear, something else stirred, a quiet, unfamiliar strength. For years, she had lived in silence, bowing to circumstances, erasing herself to survive. But now, the world had forced her into the light, and retreat was no longer an option. She could not control the whispers, but she could control the truth she carried within, that her heart was clean, her intentions pure. And for Adrian, for the man who had shattered empires for her, she would stand. Meanwhile, the Livingston mansion simmered like a fortress under siege. The morning air buzzed with chaos as reporters swarmed the gates, their cameras hungry for a glimpse of the fallen king and his rebellious heir. Inside, the staff moved like ghosts, their whispers echoing through marble halls heavy with tension. At the heart of it all sat William, his empire trembling on fractured foundations. For decades, he had commanded respect with an iron will, shaping the world to his vision. But now, that vision lay in ruins, not by the hand of an enemy, but by the son he had raised for greatness. He replayed the scene in his mind, the defiance in Adrian's voice, the steel in his eyes, the audacity of a choice that mocked everything William held sacred. Rage still burned in his veins, yet beneath the fury coiled something colder, sharper, fear. Fear of losing Adrian forever, fear that control, once lost, could never be regained. For the first time in his life, William Livingston, the man who bent markets and crushed rivals, felt powerless. But William was not a man to surrender. Even in defeat, his mind raced, plotting moves in the silence between breaths. He could destroy Isabella with a flick of his wrist, bury her under lawsuits, scandals, ruin her reputation until the world spat out her name like poison. And yet, a sliver of doubt crept in, soft as a whisper. Would that bring Adrian back? Or would it drive him so far away that no empire could bridge the distance? Adrian, oblivious to his father's silent war, had taken Isabella far from the mansion before dawn broke. They drove with no destination, the city lights fading behind. Them, replaced by endless roads and fields bathed in the gray light of early morning. In that quiet escape, for the first time in years, Adrian felt free. Not the hollow freedom of wealth, but the raw, unfiltered freedom of choice. Isabella sat beside him, her hands knotted in her lap, the weight of the night pressing on her shoulders. She wanted to ask 100 questions. Why me? How can this work? What happens now? But the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she watched him drive, his profile calm yet fierce, like a man who had burned bridges and was unafraid to face the flames. When they stopped at a quiet overlook, the first blush of dawn painting the horizon, Adrian turned to her with a gaze that stripped away every doubt. He told her she was not a mistake, not a scandal, not a trophy to spite his father. She was the truth he had searched for in a world drowning in lies. And if the world hated them for it, so be it, because he would rather lose everything than lose her. Tears burned her eyes, not of fear, but of something deeper, something she had buried under years of hardship, hope. And for the first time, she let herself believe that love, real love, was not a fairy tale reserved for the rich, but a flame that burned fiercest in the dark. But love, though fierce, was not shield enough against the storm gathering on the horizon. In the days that followed, the backlash intensified. Former allies turned their backs on Adrian, business partners withdrew deals, and the Livingston stock wavered under the weight of scandal. The empire William had built on power and perception began to crack, piece by gilded piece. For William, humiliation was an acid that corroded every thought, every breath. Invitations vanished, whispers multiplied, and the name that once commanded awe now danced on the tongues of gossip like a fallen idol. Yet, in the ruins of his pride, something unexpected took root, a question he had never dared to ask. Had he built an empire only to lose the one thing that mattered? One evening, after days of silence, William summoned Adrian. The meeting was not in the grand halls of the mansion, but in a quiet study stripped of pretense. No cameras, no audience, just father and son, face to face in the wreckage of their... The conversation began with anger, sharp and bitter, but beneath it flowed something raw, wounds too deep to hide. For the first time, William spoke not as a titan of industry, but as a man afraid of dying alone, his empire meaningless without the son he loved in a way he had never learned to show. And for the first time, Adrian saw the cracks in the armor. The loneliness behind the power, the fear behind the pride. There were no apologies, not in words, but there was something more fragile, more human, understanding. A truce forged not in victory, but in surrender. Not to each other, but to the truth neither could escape. William agreed to let go, not because he approved, but because he loved his son more than his legacy. And Adrian, though unyielding in his choice, extended a hand, not of rebellion, but of reconciliation. It was not the ending the world expected. It was not perfect, but it was real. As for Isabella, she walked through the fire and emerged tempered like steel. The whispers never ceased, the judgment never faded, but she no longer bowed her head. She stood beside Adrian, not as a maid, not as a scandal, but as a woman who had faced the wrath of an empire and survived. And when the cameras turned away, when,